Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's podcast, which we're going to be talking about horror. And you're listening to Daryl, Tom, and Dan. And we're going to be discussing horror films and just what we think go into a good horror flick. I think we talked about it briefly, and we said that horror films are a bit, there's so many of them, but to kind of go into detail on each one, we probably need to do individual podcasts on them, but we'll kind of talk broadly about it, and I guess kind of talk about films individually as well. But yeah, I find it's difficult to know where to start with horror. I think you can look back to like early horror movies and the types of films from like the black and white films from like the 20s and 30s and all the way up into the 50s, and I don't necessarily think of these movies as horror the way that we think of horror now.
It's true.
But I definitely can name some of the movies from the 70s that fall into this category. So I guess if we use that maybe as a reference point and jump off from there. But I don't know, Dan, what do you think horror's changed in sort of,
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think, horror's changed quite a lot, actually. I mean, when I was growing up, horror was like quite a big thing for me. Do you know what I mean? I've always enjoyed movies, but horror was the thing that sort of stood out for me. I remember going to video shops and sort of seeing, when we had video shops, back then we didn't have the internet, and so when
we had to explain what a video shop is.
Yeah, it feels like that now, doesn't it? I mean,
it does.
But yeah, I mean, some of the pictures I used to see, like you look at the shelf and you see all these different horror films, and they really stood out to me. I was really intrigued by them, and I feel that like there's so many good horror films back then. And I remember growing up, there's so much variation. I feel that there was a lot more variation back then. Now I feel it's more about the gore and about how many kills there are, and that sort of.
Now it seems to be about
the blood and all that.
Pushing it to the extreme now.
Yeah, and it's not so much about like they had really good storylines back then. It wasn't just about the blood and things like that. It was you had films like The Fly. I mean that was a brilliant horror film. I love that film.
Yeah, The Fly was fantastic.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant film, and that wasn't, even though it was it was gruesome, but it was it was more about it was sort of like in a way a kind of love story. Do you know what I mean? And you really felt for the main character, which was played by Jeff Goldblum, and he was brilliant in that. But we saw his transformation. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, The Fly was actually a remake. So
yeah,
I've not seen the original version
yeah.
myself, but so I'm only familiar with the same one that you are, with the Jeff Goldblum version. And I mean, I remember thinking to myself, because I used to love that film as a child. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and there are parts of it which I'm sure if I was to watch that film again today, I would still probably cringe at. The scene when he breaks the guy's arm, and the scene when he's still like not enjoy watching. I mean,
oh yeah. But even like I said, even though it's gruesome, like obviously, like I say, and today you got like all the gore and all that sort of thing. Even though it was gruesome, it had so many more elements to the film, and it was done in such a good way, such a sort of it was.
I remember when it was on the TV channel. This is in the mid-90s, I think, and I'd heard about it, and I'd heard that it was quite gruesome, and I remember it starting and being really intrigued by the story. Like I love the setup of it, where he was just like. Straight away he's like this kind of odd character at the party, and then he's like, come back, and I'll show you this thing, and he goes to this warehouse, and then all of a sudden you realise that he's working on this teleportation device, and I don't know, it seemed like it was more kind of science fiction-y horror, like you said. It's got a really
I was going to say it's got that sci-fi element to it.
Yeah, but I find that a lot of films back then were a bit more like that. It was more about having a monster, like you had The Thing, that was a brilliant horror film. Alien, that's they were horror films, but it was more of like a monster element to it, didn't it? And I don't know.
But, I mean, it was interesting what you were saying, about recent films, and I kind of agree when you say, they're more like really gruesome. We're probably talking about the Saw movies and things like that. It's just about pushing, right, how gory can we make these? But do you not think that like back in the 80s they kind of did that as well? I mean, there were films that.
They did,
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to, the Evil Dead films, for example,
Yeah.
Like, although they kind of,
Yeah,
I mean,
a bit
they're
of a
considered really
B-movie,
slapstick
really,
now,
aren't they?
when you look back on them, but back in the day they were considered pretty extreme. I mean, if you think about, I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen like the first Evil Dead, but you know, like there's scenes with like people being hacked up and
Yeah.
you know, raped by
But
trees and all sorts of stuff, and it's really crazy to think that back then that
was
they
that
would
more
consider
classed as a
doing
B
that.
movie? Would you say now? Like, because there was a few others like that, wasn't there? Like Brain Dead and Bad Taste. Reanimator was another one. Like,
I mean, it's definitely considered that way now, but I mean, I think back then, I mean, the Evil Dead, from what I remember, was, you know, I think it was banned when it first came out. So I think that they thought it was, they thought it was pretty bad.
Yeah,
back then.
and it was just like a regular movie sort of thing. It wasn't necessarily like I guess it was. I don't know. Was it low budget at the
Funny
time?
enough,
I don't know.
I think a lot of horror films are quite low budget, aren't they? I think they are, a lot of the big ones were done on quite a small budget
compared to what we're used to.
But,
definitely.
yeah, go on.
I mean,
Sorry.
I guess. Well, I was going to mention like Wes Craven and the Nightmare on Elm Street films. That's kind of what I think of when I think of like horror films.
Definitely.
When I think back to from the 80s and that was kind of my first. If you'd have asked me when I was younger what horror films were and things, I probably would have said things like the Halloween movies, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Halloween's brilliant, brilliant film.
I suppose they're like your typical slasher movies, aren't they? And they evolved into stuff like Scream.
Yeah.
But back in the day, you had Michael Myers, you had Jason.
I think that Halloween started it all off, though, didn't it? That's what I like about that. Even though there's a lot of slasher films that have been since that, I think that was one of the first ones, wasn't it? And it started off a lot of that sort of slasher trend, and it was done in such a good way as well.
Yeah,
it was done.
It's iconic now, isn't it? I mean, everyone knows Michael Myers, and if you start playing that music, then everyone knows that that's from Halloween.
Yes.
So, and it's obviously inspired a generation of copycats.
Yeah, and remakes. For
better and sequels.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I feel about the sort of remakes, really. I don't know if they have just run out of ideas, or if they just think, we can just jump on the bandwagon and, it's a name that we can make money from. It's already an established franchise.
Exactly, it's the word franchise. I think studios particularly don't want to let anything go. You could have an absolutely fantastic film, and they think, okay, how can we expand on that and make even more money off it? Which is, in a way, a shame, because you potentially ruining something that's iconic and great, but in a way people do probably want to see more of it, so I don't think there's necessarily any harm if it's done right.
The thing is, that's the problem. I don't think it's ever done right. They just seem, the money is such a big factor, because they almost know these films aren't going to be very good when they make them. It's all about money. They make it and they know people are going to see it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It's just so they can bring a string of films out and make money, and the quality's not there like it used to be. But
do you think that is the case, that they make it kind of thinking, it might not be that good, or do you not think maybe they do like a good a job as they can with it?
I don't know, really. I just reckon it's like I said, they just try and especially as it's been made before. If it's been a film that's remade and the original was really good, I'm always like a believer if a film's that good, it's better left alone. I don't feel that they how can they make it better if it's a remake, in my opinion. But I reckon a lot of these production companies, it is about money now. I feel that they think, I don't necessarily think this is going to be that good, but I know people are going to see it. I know it's going to make money, and we're just going to make, we can make as many of these as, and it's just going to make money. That's my opinion anyway.
You can tell with certain franchises like Saw, which is getting another film this year, but has had 7 films before it, that they were just churning them out every year, and it was diminishing quality every single time. It was just for the sake of, we need a horror film out with Saw name on it on Halloween. That was all it was about.
You always find that with these, obviously when they start these string of films, the first one's normally pretty good, isn't it? The first films are normally, the first 1 or 2 are pretty good, and then it starts going downhill then, doesn't it? Like the first Halloween, I thought that's really good in my opinion, and then after that, the second wasn't too bad. And then after that, it sort of started going downhill a bit.
I like the second
Saw,
one.
I quite like Saw, to be honest. The first Saw I thought was good actually.
Yeah.
You know, it maybe it wasn't acted maybe the best acting, and it had a few flaws, but I think overall it was a pretty good film. You know, it had a really good catch at the end. It was
when I first saw the Halloween films, the second one, I really liked it simply because it was set straight after the first one.
So that's exactly what I was going to say. That's what I loved about it.
It felt really unique because of that factor.
It's the same night.
Yeah. It's literally just it carries on. So I thought that was really, really good. And I wish that they would have that. Well, I mean, they do.
I shot him 6 times. I shot him in the heart.
I wish that they could come up with ideas to have that same kind of originality in films like in more recent times. But like you say, with things like Saw, it's just churning it out, and it gets worse and worse.
I think that's another thing.
I still think it's got quite an intricate story. The Saw movies, you know, I think it's definitely, you know, the way that what I found interesting about those films is the way the story kind of interweaves back and forth between different films. I thought that was quite a clever way that they did it. But you were right. I think by the end of the series, they'd kind of exhausted it, which is probably why they're kind of rebooting it or doing whatever they're doing with it now.
I think the worst thing that they did with that film was kill off John Kramer in the third one. I think if they hadn't done that, because he was such a... I mean, I can't remember the actor's name off the top of my head now, but as John Kramer, that guy is like... He's really, really good. He brings such a character and to that film, and I think that killing him off, really, they keep bringing him back, like, not from the grave, but he's in every film still as a flashback, and just imagine how much better those
why did we kill him off?
Just imagine how much better those films would be if he was actually still alive and he was the villain.
I was going to say that, like, maybe they thought, you know, they're not going to make any more, so, but I think they did. They had the plan from the start to make quite a few, didn't they? After the first,
that's it. I was going to say, I don't know why they were aiming for a trilogy, really. But no, I still think they took it in different directions, and I thought it was clever the way that they brought it back and things. And I don't know that there's... I mean, thinking about the, like, I don't know how many Friday the 13th films you guys have seen from the 80s, but I've seen a lot of them, and one... I mean, you know, again, that's another kind of franchise or series of films that really goes downhill, I think, the more that you go in. But I feel that they made them for the audience back then. You know, they were making these Friday the 13th films... not just to kind of add to the franchise or, you know, we can put another one out, but it feels like, right, what haven't we done with Jason? Okay, we'll do Jason in Manhattan, and now we're going to do Jason in space, and you know, but it just kind of
that's maybe because they're just running out of ideas. They thought, how can we make this different?
But I guess they were, but it's just kind of like, I don't know, it felt at the time like maybe they were doing it for the audience. Maybe I'm wrong.
I've got to admit, when I was watching, I've not seen all of them, but I've seen maybe up to 5 or 6. And I remember as I was watching through them, I kind of started to find Jason quite cool. I don't know whether that was right or wrong, but the fact that he gradually became like indestructible, and seeing people, I think there's one where he's like surrounded by a group of military guys, and they're literally laying into him with assault rifles, and he just takes it. And I remember thinking, Jason's a badass.
Yeah, that's the last one. I think
that's another thing that happens with these films. They start off serious and they become these characters. They sort of add a bit of comedy to it, don't they? They become more light-hearted. These characters. It's a bit like with Freddy Krueger as well. Like in the first one, he was more sort of serious, and as it went on, they added a few more comical elements to it, didn't they? Where you started getting a bit more.
I guess the audience latch on to those little quirky bits, don't they? And then that becomes, you know, that gets kind of elaborated, doesn't it, throughout the other films that they end up doing.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not, you know, we're saying about sort of horror films now compared to the older ones, but I still think, you know, I don't think the majority are that amazing, but there is still some really good horrors around.
I think that's one problem with horror. I mean, I'm not the best kind of horror, you know, critic, I guess, because I don't like horror films really. I don't watch them. I've seen them, but it's not something that I'll go out of my way to watch. But yeah, it's I immediately kind of feel disconnected when, you know, we should split up because we can cover more ground this way, and you know the plot devices of I've got no signal on my phone, and you know it's always kind of it always feels like it's the same things that, you know, it's always the same kind of
I think
setup
that's
for these films, and I
that's
think
some of the biggest things that annoy me about horrors. I think is that I know, okay, it's a horror and you've got to have things like that sometimes, but they go over the top with it. It's so unrealistic. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're never scared either, are they? These people, like, sometimes all this stuff's happened. They're in this house on their own. They're like, you know, I'm not scared. You know, I sat in the dark and this. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
I don't know. The characters in Scream, they seem pretty scared.
especially the killer.
Do you not think? I mean, the Scream trilogy.
But
I mean, for me, like the horror films that, you know, that I like, I mean, whether they're, you know, should be as horror or not, but the ones, you know, the 90s, so like The Faculty, the Scream films, and what was the other ones that came out around that same time with the Hook guy?
I mean, I know what you did last summer.
Yeah, like those ones, you know, they were, that was almost like a new generation of horror movies that came out around that time.
I think they lack the originality, and I think that's why they go back to remaking the films that were good. Like, they struggle to find that originality, don't they? And I don't know, really. That applies to all films, to be honest, at the moment. But what I liked about those old horror films is they used a lot of, like, they built the sets themselves. It might have been someone dressed up in a suit, but to me that looked more real. I find that look more real. They go over the top with the CGI, and it takes the scare factor away. Like back then, you might only have glimpses of, like, the alien, and that made it more scary. Do you know what I mean? Or, like, going back to The Fly, you know, when you see him at the end, you see his legs to begin with. You don't see his whole body, and it shows different parts. And that might be because maybe it was more difficult because they're using the real. You know, it's real stuff they're using, but it makes it more scary, in my opinion.
Great example of this was last night. So when was it? Yesterday, I bought Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on Blu-ray, and I watched it last night, the 1990s version, and it still looks amazing. It's still like a dark film. The suits, okay, yes, the mouths, you can kind of tell they're, you know, animatronics or whatever, but that stands up so much better than what the new ones do, because just as you said, Dan, it's so over the top with, you know, they're all like crashing down the hill and everything, and it takes you out of it.
Another film I'd like to talk about is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, actually. I don't know if
the original
you guys
one.
It's
funny because on the IMDb trivia I read that originally he was going for a PG certificate because most of
I know I read
most of it happens off screen, and it ended up being banned, I think, in a lot of places, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I remember that. I mean, growing up, I was so intrigued by that film. I remember, like once again going back to, that's it. And it's always the older people, like your parents, who would tell you, "Oh, I saw that in the cinema," and you know, you'd hear all this stuff about it. And like, once again, because the internet wasn't massive then, it was like there was nothing really you could find. You know, it's only stories that you heard. You couldn't really, you know, look on the internet and all that sort of thing now. And I remember just being so intrigued by that. And because, like you said, it was banned. I remember actually ordering it from America finally to watch it. And I remember just watching and thinking, like, it's funny because it hasn't actually really got any blood in it, but it's the feeling that it's what it makes you feel after you've seen it. It just gives you that sort of. It makes you think. It stays in your mind, and once again, that's another thing with these older
it's
films.
The kind of time. It's with it being set, sort of. Well, not being set, but it's like, you know, from the 70s and things like that, and the style of it and things. It's quite, that adds to it, doesn't it? That adds to the kind of horror element.
I think so. And also the way it's filmed, like it's got like a grainy look to it. Almost
and I think that's quite hard to recapture for now, isn't it? Because everyone's got a you know, a HD camera on your phone, so it's hard to get that same effect, I think.
But it's almost got it feels quite real, like not just the way it's filmed, but even the way it's acted. I don't know if it's the way it's so naturally. I don't know, maybe because there's no pressure to. I don't know what it is, but when you watch like Leatherface in it, he just, you know, in the new one he's going around. They've tried to make him totally different, and it's, you know, but in that it's just, I don't know. He just seems like more of not like a real person in a way, like. I don't know what it is about it. It just feels more real. I was
just trying to think of what's that other film? I was taking it from like one sort of thing to another, like just complete opposites. But what was that film that came out? It's like, is it The Cabin in the Woods where have you guys seen that?
Yeah.
But again, it starts off as like a normal one, but it just made me think of it then, because we were kind of saying, you know, oh, that film kind of set in the 70s is a very kind of normal thing. But then you've got films now where, you know, you haven't got the grainy effects and things like that, but, you know, you can do a lot more with the effects. And I liked Cabin in the Woods right up until about the last 5 minutes when you see that weird, like, alien thing or something.
Is that Sigourney Weaver in it? Is she in at the end or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's the whole point, to try and just like to be not what you thought, isn't it? Like, it's supposed to, you think it's going to be one thing and it just totally goes somewhere.
I think that was good, but yeah, but it's almost like, again, it's like a subgenre. It's like a horror / sci-fi sort of film, isn't it? But I liked that, you know, I do like that it makes it different, because I do remember watching that and thinking, oh, this is going to be a horror film, and then yeah, like, you know, 45 minutes in or whatever, it does suddenly change. You're like, what is going on? You know, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, one other little. Did you guys know that? Like, I read this, but you know, the Halloween mask. Did you know that it was originally a William Shatner mask? That they,
I
they
did.
cut the eyes out and painted white or something.
Yeah, I found out like years, because I watched the film in like the mid-90s, but I found out it was probably, I don't know, like early 2000s maybe. It might have been on IMDb maybe, and then I was like, I read it and I was like, what? And I had to like go and research it further to find out if that was actually true. But yeah, okay, so that probably wraps it up for the horror one anyway. I have no idea what we're going to do next, but we'll figure it out, I guess. Okay, so yeah, we've been Daryl, Dan and Tom, and we'll see you on the next one.